Hey guys, welcome to another episode of GH Reacts. Thanks for checking in once again. How are you guys? So, if you saw the thumbnail and the title of the video, you know what this is all about, right? We're going to settle it once and for all. The Beatles or the Stones, man. We're going to settle it right here and right now. We're not going to settle anything today. I'm just going to give you a little foresight into what this video is going to do. It's not really going to settle anything, but I just wanted to really react to Paul McCartney. So if you haven't heard, Paul McCartney the other day, he did an interview. He's been doing interviews a lot last few years, and I have some thoughts on that I'll get into. But he called the Rolling Stones a blues cover band. I don't remember the exact quote, but he kind of said like the Beatles were always more wide ranging than them, and they were just they were really just a blues cover band, you know. To which Mick replied on stage the other night, something about like there's a lot of people in the audience and Paul's going to join us for a blues cover or something like that. Just kind of very innocuous and quick little thing just to know that, you know, hey, we heard it. Yeah, we heard what you said, and, you know, that's that. And, you know, it did kind of stir a lot of those thoughts in my head about the question that everybody has of whether or not it's the Beatles or the Stones. Do you like the Beatles or the Stones? And I feel like these days that question is kind of like fallen by the wayside. I remember when I was younger and the friends of mine that were like classic rock fans as well, they, you know, a lot of them, believe it or not, were against me and my Beatles love. And when I was growing up, I was 100% Beatles. I didn't really listen to Stones hardly at all. And I'm not really sure why. I just never really got into them as much. And I was just a certified Beatles freak. I still am. But I, over the years, came to appreciate the Rolling Stones and like them very much now. And I listen to them all the time. But not as much as I like the Beatles. There's always going to be that it's the Beatles and then it's everybody else for me. It's just the way I'm built, guys. I really can't explain it any other way. But, you know, some people love the Beatles, some people hate the Beatles, and some people just kind of regard the Beatles. And, you know, personally, I think the Beatles are beyond music. They're beyond their pop culture slash... in a thousand years, what are they going to be looking at from that century of music? You know, if you look at the 20th century and you think of one act that is going to define the 20th century, it's going to be the Beatles. It's just the way it is, okay? It's just the way it is. But, you know, obviously, my thoughts on Paul. So, you know, one thing I've noticed about people getting older, my grandmother is 96, or not, no, 96. She's 96, okay? And one thing that I noticed about people getting older is their filter goes away, right? They just say whatever comes to their mind. And it's one of those things that can be very funny at times. It can be very, like, you know, cringy at the same time, but I do feel as though, you know, Paul's getting to that age now, he's 79, where the filter is just going away. And when somebody asks him something, he's just going to tell them the truth, or at least the truth as far as he sees it, you know? And whatever comes to his mind and whatever he's been thinking for all these years, it's just going to say it. So personally, I think people should do a lot more interviews with Paul, because you're going to get the dish now. You know, there was a story some years back about how the Beatles took part in a mutual, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. You guys can use your imaginations, but you probably remember the headlines. And I thought to myself, Paul, why do we need to know that, dude? Like, why do we need to know that? Seriously. I think that's kind of what's happening with Paul is the guardrails are coming down. You know, his need to kind of play the whole media game is kind of going away in his mind. So he's like thinking to himself, I'm just going to say what the hell I want to say. I'm not going to, you know, worry about it anymore. So now, of course, the question comes, is Paul correct? Is Paul right about the Rolling Stones? Are they just a blues cover band? No, they're not just a blues cover band. They're a blues inspired band. You know, if you go, the Rolling Stones, you know, I always like to see bands that progress. That if they're around for as long as the Rolling Stones or even the Beatles, they were around for 8, 9 years, 10 years, whatever, depending on how you slice it. Whether it's the time of their first album to the time of their last or whatever, it was 8 years. But I like to say 10 years because they started as the Beatles earlier than that in Hamburg and everything like that. So a band that's around for a long period of time, I like to see them progress and like get better music, not change their identities, not be different people, but just try to push the envelope musically. And I feel like both the Beatles and the Stones did that. Now, to what extent is anybody's guess. Personally, I think the Beatles pushed the envelope more. And I think all you have to look at is the Stones in the 60s and how they progressed as a band. They were very Beatles-centric early on, right? It wasn't until the Beatles were done and the Stones lost Brian Jones that I feel like the Stones really kind of ramped into their, what I would call their classic period with Mick Taylor and their great albums with, that run with Sticky Fingers and obviously Exile and, going on all those albums from there from till like 1975 or so. But if you look back on that, like the Stones did kind of follow the Beatles' lead very much. They got into psychedelic stuff. They did like, mystical kind of instruments the way the Beatles did. They followed the sitar. They followed things of that nature, even though, the Stones did enough of their trailblazing too. But for the most part, the Stones followed the Beatles, but they never really lost what I would call their identity. They still had that like swagger, that kind of darker feel to them. Their songs were darker, Mother's Little Helper and songs like The Last Time, 19th Nervous Breakdown. They really looked at things that were different. They looked at like, mental health. Back in those days, that wasn't really a thing, and they had more swagger, more sex appeal, things of that nature. So, I think the Stones stayed true to themselves while also following the Beatles' lead from a pop sensibility standpoint. And then when it no longer mattered and the Stones could kind of step out of the Beatles' shadow in the early 70s, I think that they knocked it out of the park, man. I mean, those albums speak for themselves, Sticky Fingers, Exile, Some Girls. Those albums are classics, and I think that, with the Beatles, if they'd continued, I don't know if they would have been as popular as they had become, who knows? So, in retrospect, when you think of like what Paul said, if you were taking just the Beatles and the Stones, right, from a musical standpoint, the Beatles are obviously a little bit better, even though from a standpoint of like Charlie Watts is a better drummer technically than Ringo, right? I would say Keith Richards and John Lennon are kind of a wash. I would say that Mick Jagger and I think Paul McCartney is musically the best member of the Beatles, and I think that's who kind of pushes them over the edge. But that doesn't mean at the age of 79, you have to start talking trash on a band that went on to great success, really had a lot of success before the Beatles broke up. The Rolling Stones were always right there, on their tail. And they did a lot of great stuff through the 60s too. So let's not, just eliminate everything that they did. But, the point is that I think Paul was just, why? That's kind of what I've been saying every time Paul puts his foot in his mouth these days. It's like, why, man? Like, why do we either need to hear that, or why do we need to know that? Or why are you thinking that? Because really, in the scheme of things, these days, instead of burning bridges, you should be like, trying to say, oh, everybody's great, man. Everybody was great. Everybody was great in those days. It was the greatest era of music ever. And it's not a lie, There's so many bands that came out of the 60s behind the Beatles. And yes, they blazed the way. Yes, they set the pace, But at the end of the day, so many other bands musically just exploded out of what the Beatles started. And, the Rolling Stones were kind of around at the same time as the Beatles. So I don't really count them because they were doing their thing even when the Beatles were very new. So, you know, it's a little bit different. Like the bands like the Who and the Kinks and you know, some of those bands later in the 60s, like 64, 65, they were clearly influenced by the Beatles. Only they were like, we're gonna just amp this up to the next level. We're just gonna to the dial just a little bit. We're gonna crank it. We're gonna do this, you know. But I felt like the Stones did that pretty early on with some of their blues covers and some of their Chuck Berry covers. Like they were incendiary very early, even in '63 when they took the stage. They were really, really good. And you know, I think that I just think it had been a long time since they were a blues cover band, Paul. Like you don't need to. You don't need to go there. It's just unnecessary to start a feud with the Rolling Stones when everybody's in their late 70s. It's just dumb. It just doesn't make any sense. But anyway, obviously I'd like to hear your thoughts. Beatles or Stones, first of all. What do you guys think? I think, you know, like I said, I regard both bands not equally. I'm always going to be a Beatles guy. If you had to hold a gun to my head and say, which one do you pick? If I had to throw away every record from one band and only let you keep the records from another band, my choice would be the Beatles 99 million times out of 99 million. I mean, it's just the way it is for me. But at the same time, I would be upset about losing my Stones records. You know, I think that it's, you know, I think they're good enough. But, you know, what do you think? And what did you think of what Paul said? Obviously, that's the second question about, you know, the Stones being a blues cover band. Personally, I think that it was out of line and it was unnecessary and it was just plain wrong because I think the Rolling Stones have a lot more of a catalog and I think they have a lot of hits and I think that they're on their own kind of pedestal, maybe a little bit lower than the Beatles, but they're on a pedestal. They're on one of the, you know, pinnacles of rock and roll. Whether you want to put like 5 pedestals out and like you say, what do you say? Like the Beatles, the Stones, Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, and like who's the 5th person? Who's the 5th one? Jimmy. You know, that would probably be the 5 of the, you know, the Mount Rushmore, even though there's 5, you know what I mean? But yeah, man, I mean, I thought like when I read it, I was like, come on, man, like this is stupid. You know, like I get you think the Beatles are better and you may well be right. But at this point in your, like this has already been kind of decided. You know what I mean? Like in that when the Beatles release something, like it goes to number 1. When the Stones release something, all the Stones fans buy it. And there's a lot of Stones fans, but not enough to make things go to number 1. But it is what it is, right? It's just the way it is. The Beatles are universal. The Beatles are always going to be known as the best band from that era. You don't need to say it, Paul. It's not necessary. It just makes you look like an a-hole. Just thought you'd like to know. Anyway, let me know what you guys think. I'll just go on and on about this forever if you let me. But I'll let you go. And we'll see you next time on GH Reacts. Thanks for checking in.